So today I want to talk about why Trump is right to go to North Korea. I disagree with pretty much everything that Trump does, but when he does something right, I think it is important for people in general and especially for progressive to call him out, congratulate him, egg him on when he's doing the right thing. And I think this is one of those moments where he is doing the right thing, but the media and the Democratic Party as a whole has gone so anti Trump that they're actually not criticizing him from a left wing position, but they're actually trying to outflank him on the right, if you know what I mean. They're calling him weak, basically saying he's negotiating with dictators around the world. He's some kind of, we've heard Democrats saying he's Putin's puppet, while at the same time the US would be getting closer and closer to war with Russia. Now, it may not actually be Trump's doing that the US is getting closer to war with Russia. Congress passes increased sanctions. We're back indirectly fighting against Russian troops in Syria. Obviously, Russia is highly aggressive and territorially expanding, kind of neo-imperialist. So they are our adversary. However, you can't say that the president is some kind of Russian puppet just because the Russian government aided and embedded his campaign. However, that's a topic for another day. But basically, you just have all these left-wing people trying to criticize Trump from the right, saying he's not being aggressive enough against foreign dictatorships. He shouldn't be negotiating with these people. And that is a horrible position to put the Democratic Party in, and we should congratulate him when he uses diplomacy instead of doing what his advisors would probably tell him to do, which is military action. So let's just start with what's going on right now. So in a historic moment, Donald Trump stepped into North Korea to meet with Chairman Kim, obviously the dictator of North Korea. Historically, President Obama was heavily criticized by the right for agreeing to negotiate with America's adversaries. That includes North Korea, Iran, China, Russia, and others. The left at the time rightfully defended Obama because we should always aim for diplomatic solutions with our adversaries. This is the kind of mentality that allowed Obama to negotiate the Iran nuclear deal. That's one of his crowning achievements as president, in my opinion, especially in terms of foreign policy. Obviously, Trump recently pulled out of the Iran deal, and Iran is now on the path to make nuclear weapons. Him and his advisors are putting us on the warpath with Iran. But I talked about that in some other videos, so we're going to move on. Now Trump is negotiating with North Korea. Many Democrats, though, are criticizing him for negotiating with our enemies and dictators. It's a horrible thing to attack Trump on because the alternative to negotiations is a military response. Democrats need to stop criticizing Trump from the right. We should be criticizing him from the left. You cannot outflank far-right people from the right. It's a ridiculous notion. I see the media doing it all the time, saying, it's weak for a president to kind of kowtow to these dictators. Well, we should really do anything to prevent war. I mean, I don't think these people really understand the cost of war, both in terms of lives and obviously in terms of actual finances. I mean, the media and the right constantly asks progressives how they're going to pay for their policies, but at the same time, they push these insanely expensive regime change wars costing trillions of dollars and tens of thousands of American lives and countless foreign lives, destabilizing regions for decades. No one asks how we afford those things, but obviously we could afford these regime change wars. We could afford military action in North Korea. We could afford new missiles, new defense weapons. I mean, we shouldn't be criticizing Trump for going the diplomatic route because his advisors, John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, they're whispering in his ear as we speak that we need to be militarily engaged with North Korea. We need to have defensive, measures on the Korean border. We need to continue to have joint military training drills with South Korea. We need missiles in South Korea and Japan, all leading us closer and closer to war. And on this specific issue, Trump is going the route of diplomacy, which is the right thing to do. So stop fucking criticizing him, okay? There is so much legitimate criticism to be had. Just look at Iran. This is what happens when Trump listens to his advisors, unlike in North Korea. In Iran, we're going closer and closer to being on the war path, whereas in North Korea, we're actually in a relatively safe position, safer than we were before. And now you could easily say that, a year ago or longer, Trump was somewhat responsible for the turmoil and the relationship between the U.S. and North Korea. I know he had tweeted some things about, Little Rocket Man, calling Kim Jong Un that, tweeted about how we could destroy their country, horrible things, all in crazy Twitter rampages. But right now we're in a relatively stable peace, and we should not be encouraging Trump to end that peace. We should congratulate him on his diplomacy. I mean, if negotiations fail, we just end up in a situation like what's happening in Iran or even Venezuela, where it's very likely that conflicts will arise. American lives are at stake. I mean, in case of North Korea, just think about the millions of South Korean lives at stake if you don't care about any of the North Korean lives. Just a couple of explosions in South Korea could kill millions of people. It's a highly concentrated, tiny area. If you look back at the Korean War, millions of people died, both in the North and South, and many thousands of American lives were lost, and Chinese lives, I should add. It's said that the U.S. literally bombed every single inch of North Korea. The UN tried to set up some safe zones for civilians to hide away from the bombs, but the U.S. wouldn't have it. We literally bombed every single building, every single bridge in the entire north of Korea. So that's the history, and we know if it was going to repeat right now, we'd be in a similar situation where millions of lives would be lost. It would be likely that the Chinese would join the war as well, as they did back in the 1950s in the Korean War. They see North Korea as a buffer zone between the West and China. South Korea constantly having troops on the border, as does North Korea. The progressive movement just cannot afford to become partisan like the corporate-run media, like the Democratic establishment, Nancy Pelosi. You have these pseudo-progressives like Elizabeth Warren kind of fear-mongering against North Korea, but really calling Trump weak for negotiating, which is not what we want. We need to encourage progressives, or at least pseudo-progressives like Warren, real progressives like Bernie Sanders, to stand up against the Democratic establishment and the narrative that the media will tell you that it is weak to negotiate with dictators. Because if you think about it for 2 fucking seconds, what is the alternative route? There is no alternative except war. That's what happens when diplomacy breaks down. Now, there is some legitimate criticism against Trump going to North Korea. Not that it's weak to negotiate, but there is criticism that Trump is only going to North Korea for a photo op. We've seen many times in the past, he talks about how he should have won the Nobel Prize, or should win the Nobel Prize, for his negotiations in North Korea. That's just completely ridiculous in my opinion, because basically he and his predecessors really set up this horrible situation with North Korea failing to negotiate in the past. Trump tweeted all these horrible things I mentioned before, and then he fixed it. It's like he lit the oil fire and then put it out, and now we got to give him a medal for it. No, thank you. that's just ridiculous. So there's some legitimate criticism that he's not really in North Korea to negotiate, but just to increase his own popularity. That's probably true. However, we will not go to war with North Korea when Trump's in North Korea. When there's a line of communication, it's so much less likely that war happens. I mean, this is the reason why after the Cuban Missile Crisis, a direct line between Moscow and Washington was established, really to prevent war. I mean, North Korea is likely to have nuclear weapons now. We cannot afford a nuclear war with North Korea. I mean, South Korea would be completely destroyed, or other allies like Japan would be completely annihilated. We would probably respond in a nuclear attack as well. I mean, China has many, many very advanced nuclear weapons. This just cannot happen. It would be both a humanitarian and it would be an environmental crisis, the likes of which we have never really seen. So there is legitimate criticism of Trump. There's plenty of it on a host of issues, but we can't be so anti-Trump that we deviate from our own beliefs. You know what I mean? Especially these presidential candidates. You can't be just anti-Trump. You have to be for something. You cannot win. You cannot become the president because you are anti-Trump, or you end up just attacking him from the right. You saw this when he was talking about pulling troops out of Iraq and Afghanistan. You had these, the corporate media and Democratic establishment criticizing him, telling him it was a horrible thing to do. We were abandoning our allies in the region. I mean, all of it was ridiculous. And the thing is, he didn't even end up pulling any troops out of Iraq or Afghanistan in the end, because I'm sure his advisors like Mike Pompeo and others, and just him listening to the media and listening to the Democratic establishment and accepting their narrative, kind of forced him in a way to not pull out the troops from these hostile areas. And that's exactly what you're going to do with North Korea. If you just keep criticizing him over and over for negotiating, his only alternative is to stop negotiating, put more sanctions on, and really lead us closer and closer to war. Let's not let that happen. If Trump continues to negotiate, let's congratulate him. If he decides to start negotiating with Iran instead of going on the war path, if he does the same thing in Venezuela, do not criticize Trump. That is a good thing. We must encourage him to do the right thing when he does do the right thing. So let's hope there's peace in North Korea, in Iran, in Venezuela, and have a good one. Peace to you all.